That decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse. Now, pull, in the usage of Larry Silverstein there, means to demolish. It's used elsewhere in the documentary by a civil engineer of New York City referring to what they did in regard, or were contemplating in regard to Building 6. Pull means to demolish. Now, we need to now consider what a demolition of a building the size of Building 7 would entail in terms of time of preparation. And it was very useful for me to visit a site that's up for Controlled Demolition, Inc., which is a name you should remember, a company you should remember. It was hired to administer some of the cleanup of the World Trade Center complex after the atrocities of 9/11/01. But on that site, Controlled Demolition, Inc. speaks of world records that it's set in terms of executing demolitions. And one of those refers to the J.L. Hudson building in Detroit, which was the largest department store in downtown Detroit, became, financially unfeasible with the spread to the malls and so forth. 1998, Controlled Demolition, Inc. was contracted to bring down J.L. Hudson department store. And on the CDI site, we read this. After 4 months of study by associate contractors, that it was 4 months of simply going through what they had to do in order to demolish this 35-story building of about 2 million square feet. That is a building just about the same size in square feet as WTC 7. CDI's 12-person loading crew took 24 days to place 4,118 separate charges in 1,100 locations on columns in 9 levels in the complex. Over 36,000 feet of detonating cord and 4,512 non-electric delay elements were installed in CDI's implosion initiation system, some to create the 36 primary implosion sequences and another 216 micro delays to keep down the detonation overpressure from the 2,728 pounds of explosives which would be detonated during the demolition. What we have is 4 months plus an additional 24 days needed to place the charges necessary to demolish within its 420-foot by 220-foot footprint, a building 12 stories smaller than WTC 7, which means, of course, that they could not have demolished WTC 7 without a great deal of advanced preparation, which means, of course, that Larry Silverstein and the other leaseholders of WTC 7, the Blackstone Group, Bank of America Securities, and the General American Acceptance Corporation had to have foreknowledge of the preparation of that demolition. And this, to me, leads right into the heart of the crimes of 9/11/01. It leads to the heart of the financial establishment. It tells us that these people expected to bring down WTC 7 as part of the crimes of that day. That is the only way that the admitted demolition of the building makes sense, as horrific as that connection may be to you. So I think it's incumbent upon us now to examine Peter G. Peterson, the chairman of the board of the Blackstone Group, also at the time of 9/11/01, the chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most important bank in that central bank of the United States, and chairman at that time of the Council on Foreign Relations. Peter G. Peterson, in his roles, not only profited from the results of the demolition of WTC 7, and we should briefly enumerate those profits in terms of the insurance payout. By the time of its demolition, there was about $386 million invested in WTC 7. In February of 2002, a court awarded Larry Silverstein and the other leaseholders $861 million, meaning that they made an immediate profit of $475 million by the destruction of that building. But what I want to consider more is the overall gains to the financial establishment of the United States and Europe from 9/11/01. And that means, of course, dealing with the ensuing invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And here we can briefly look at some facts in terms of the gains and profits that were made by armaments companies. And we see that Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics all increased their Defense Department contracts by magnitudes of over 30% in the 2 years after 9/11/01. We also see that oil corporations, Royal Dutch Shell, ExxonMobil, British Petroleum, Chevron Texaco, increased their profits by fantastic amounts after 9/11/01. We see Royal Dutch Shell going from $4.5 billion to $8.2 billion. We see ExxonMobil almost quadrupling its profits, going from $4.7 billion to $17.2. We see British Petroleum going from $3.4 to $5.9. We see Chevron Texaco going from $1.1 to $3.5. So this enumerates what we knew in general in terms of the oil companies profiting from the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And we know from the evidence that's been presented to us that the whole pretext, and pretext is an important word to bear in mind because it was used in the Northwoods document in 1962 and so forth. There's been one pretext after another in the United States history over more than 100 years to involve the United States in wars that benefit its financial establishment. And when we look at the entities who control the corporations that make weapons and that sell oil, we see a lot of the same people and the same entities behind those corporations. For instance, in 1972, the Chase Manhattan Bank, of which David Rockefeller was then the chairman, had a 5.2% voting stock of Mobil Oil. It had 4.5% of Atlantic Richfield. In 1993, of the 122 leading corporations in the United States, the Rockefeller family controlled more than 5% of the board membership of those 93 of the 122 top corporations. We're talking about an extreme concentration of power and wealth among a few principals. And those principals, again, show up in very close relationship to the World Trade Center buildings. So I'm going to talk briefly about the Twin Towers and how those towers' destruction were financially advantageous to some of the principles we've been examining today. And we need to look at how obsolescent those towers were at the time of their demolition. And a book by Eric Darden called Divided We Stand puts in a nice nutshell how they stood in the year 2000. Darden writes, to maintain the Trade Center as Class A office space commanding top rents, the Port Authority would have to have had spent $800 million rebuilding the electrical, electronic communication, and cooling systems. There was also the aspects of removal of asbestos from the Twin Towers that was urgent by the time of their demolition, and that was estimated to cost $1.2 billion. So we see them as white elephants standing on very valuable real estate in Lower Manhattan. Throughout their history, and their history links intimately with David Rockefeller because he was the main engine behind their construction. He made them go up in Lower Manhattan in his role as chairman of both the Chase Manhattan Bank and the Lower Manhattan Development Association. Despite all kinds of obstacles, he made them go up, and once they were up and no one wanted to rent them, he got tenants through his brother, the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller. And at the time of the transfer to Silverstein Properties from the New York Port Authority, it was widely recognized within financial circles that the New York Port Authority, which is a state agency, remained under the control, effectual control of interests dominated by the Rockefeller family, and that is dominated most by David Rockefeller. So we should look briefly also at the terms that were given Silverstein Properties at the time it took over the lease of the Twin Towers. It won the award from the New York Port Authority in April of 2001 and officially took possession in late July of 2001. And it got very favorable terms. It got a 99-year lease on the Twin Towers and much other property, 3 other buildings and a mall of 400,000 square feet for a total of $3.2 billion for a 99-year lease. The Wall Street Journal and other papers estimated at the time that the lease should have been worth $8 billion. But then we factor in the obsolescence of the Twin Towers, the amounts needed for their repair, and wonder why anyone would take them at any terms. Perhaps they were taken only because they knew they were coming down and there would be an enormous insurance payout. And we see that there indeed has been an enormous insurance payout. Larry Silverstein demanded a, quote, double occurrence for the fall of those Twin Towers, which meant that he claimed twice $3.55 billion, and the most amazing thing is evidently received it. A court awarded Silverstein Properties and the other claimants $4.8 billion last April, and they're trying to get their full claim fulfilled as we sit here now. So it is entirely suspicious, the circumstances of the award to Silverstein Properties and the subsequent insurance payouts. I think that is well worth further investigation by a body that has been entrusted to examine the crimes of 9/11/01. We should also look briefly at the overall insurance profits that occurred after 2001 if we are going to look into the financial establishment of the United States. 2 of the leading insurance companies in the United States are Berkshire Hathaway and the American International Group. Berkshire Hathaway is headed by Warren Buffett, the supposed second richest man in the world. American International Group was headed by Maurice Greenberg, who was a former chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Now, these insurance companies were able to charge enormous increases in their premiums after 9/11/01 into a market that had been flat before the destruction of those buildings. So we look at sales of Berkshire Hathaway in the year 2000 being $24 billion and some dollars, but by 2003 rising to $42 billion and some odd dollars. We look at AIG with sales of $40 billion some dollars in 2000, rising in 2003 to $69 billion some dollars. In short, they both gained about 40% in sales in those 3 years, and it's directly attributable to the atrocities that were committed on September 11th, 2001. Lastly, in terms of dealing with the immediate financial returns from the atrocities of 9/11/01, I'd like us to consider opium in Afghanistan. We well know about the oil from Iraq. We know about the pipelines that were wanted through Afghanistan for the Caspian Sea oil. That's been well explicated in even mainstream media. But what is very little mentioned in mainstream media or so-called left media is the opium from Afghanistan and its absolutely crucial role in the world's legal and illegal economies. At the time of September 11th, 2001, the Taliban, the government of Afghanistan at that time, had reduced the amount of opium production within their territory to nothing, really. You know, it had gone from 3,500 metric tons within all of Afghanistan to 187 metric tons. And all those tons were grown by farmers under the control of the Northern Alliance. And what that meant to the world's illegal economy was they lost $180 billion because that's what that opium was worth by the time it reached the streets of the West. That's a United Nations estimate. It's repeatedly cited in terms of its value. But what it means more importantly, more consequentially to the orchestrators, I would like you to further investigate, ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury, is its value to the world's legal economy. When those narcotics profits are channeled through the world's leading financial institutions, through the Chase Bank, through Barclays Bank, through Bank of America, because then the value of that $180 billion becomes the almost unimaginable sum of $3.6 trillion. And what that means to us, living as we do in the United States, is that we are complicit with a criminal economy. We're complicit with an economy that depends on people being addicted to heroin around